Hello, this is a Starsdance Mystery School workshop that we're calling House Talk. I'm Tere, and joining me is Bonnie, and we are going to be having a conversation about houses. Um, Starsdance Mystery School is a school for learning astrology, but it's also a school where we are curious about the intersection of astrology and magic and the sacred, social justice with a queer lens. And Bonnie is one of the facilitators of our school, which takes place through Patreon. That's the way that you can join our school. And then there's, like, Patreon has several tiers, and we have tiers of, just the beginning tier would be a place where you have access to our Discord and get our forecasts. We have a forecast that comes to you based on the lunar cycle, every new moon, and all the eight phases. And then we also have another forecast that comes to you that's called 36 phases, which is about the decans, the sun moving through the three parts of each sign. And so we have a lot of things that we offer. And we also offer classes. But I would love for Bonnie to introduce yourself first. And yeah, who are
Okay,
you?
thank you for the intro. So I'm Bonnie May. I'm a co-facilitator at Stardance Mystery School. I have Instagram and Twitter, and I talk a little bit of astrology there. It's May Day Astrology, which is a reference to Beltane, International Workers' Day, and my Taurus moon, and part of my name. And I do electional astrology at Stardance Mystery School and help with some of the classes. I study a bit more traditional Hellenistic astrology, but I dabble in modern and evolutionary. So we'll get to that a little bit in the house topic about like some of the different house systems and the different uses of them. But I really like learning a bit of everything. I just prefer to have one major focus. So what else? Oh, and also I'm on a few podcast episodes of the Astrology Hotline podcast, and we are going to start doing some little mini transit episodes soon. So that might be coming up in December later on. And is there anything that you want to introduce here?
Well, I just would love for people to join us. We're going to start a class on the houses
Yes.
in December, and that's why we're talking about the houses. And the subtitle for the house, it's called Queer Perspectives on the Houses, and the subtitle is A Place for Magic. And that, I think, really describes what we like to do at Stars Dance, which is approach the subject of astrology through a really personal lens. What does it mean to me? What am I understanding about myself? And we give a lot of prompts for that. And we give a lot of prompts for magic. Like, you just selected an election to do some magic. That was a really lovely chart to kind of get the wonderful energy that we've been having recently. And so, yeah, that's this whole project has really been the Stars Dance Mystery School project. I'm one of the co-founders of it. It's been really meaningful to me and really important. I've been an astrologer since the 80s, and that's going to come up in the differences between my astrology and Bonnie's astrology. And we really welcome all kinds of astrology. And I'm very excited to explore what is the difference between the modern approach is what I learned, and then the traditional approach, which is what Bonnie is learning and has learned. So we're very curious about that. Um, so in houses, this is the framework for the chart. And the houses, I'm going to share a screen with you and share one of our images here, so that you can see here that this is the diagram of a chart, and it is Placidus. We're gonna describe what is a Placidus chart in a little while, because we're gonna describe the difference between Placidus and whole sign. But when we're looking at a chart, we're going to see that every chart, no matter what house system you use, is divided into 12 wedges. And the numbers go in this direction, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 12. The number 12 is important in astrology. It's the number of signs we have, the number of the zodiacal constellations. And it's a blueprint for our lives. Each of these houses has a special meaning and an arena of life. And what we're looking at when we're looking at a chart is we're seeing the whole sky. We're seeing what's above the horizon and what's below the horizon. And over here is the ascendant. And this arrow here is pointing to how the sun moves through the chart in the course of a day. So this is called the daily motion of the chart. So the sun rises here, and then, early morning it's in the 12th house. Mid-morning it's in the 11th house. Approaching noon in the midheaven, that's when it's in the 10th house. Then afternoon it's in the ninth and 8th and and 7th, and then it sets at sunset over here where the descendant is. And so this describes, and then this point down here would be the midnight point. So all of these houses are the nighttime houses. All of these houses are the daytime houses, and that has a level of meaning to the houses as well. Is it something interior? Is it something exterior? So that's how the sun moves through the sky in the course of a day. But then this is direction is how the sun moves through the zodiac in the course of a year. So that so first there's Leo, and then what follows Leo is Virgo, and then what follows Virgo is Libra. And so slowly in the Scorpio, this is the order. These signs on the outside are in the order of the zodiac and how the sun goes from one sign and sees into the next. And that also has a meaning to the houses. So, for instance, the first house being we're born, and it's the house of identity, it's the house of being. The second house is the house of resource. And then the third house is the house of our environments and learning from our environments, and so on. So then that yearly motion of the sun is what defines our progress through the houses. There's a sense I think of the houses as being a hero's journey, or maybe not a hero's journey, but a journey through our lives where we are adding on and gathering experiences that build us as human beings. So those are just to kind of give you the idea of how the sun moves through and how the houses are created through the sun's movement, but also give you a few little pieces here that some of the language that we use will say that there's a cusp. The house has a cusp, and that is the beginning of a house. For instance, this is the cusp of the 8th house. It's the beginning point. And what's important is to look at what is the sign here and what are the degrees. So in Placidus, we'll have not the beginning of a sign, but somewhere in the middle of a sign, a house cusp will begin. And in whole sign, this will be 0 because it begins at the beginning of a sign. Each house in the whole sign system is one sign. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. But this cusp, this beginning of a house is an important thing to note because that will give us more information about the energy of that house. What's the energy of that sign? What planets rule that sign? And so on. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But just to let you know, when we talk about a house cusp, we're talking about that line there. And then there's a special thing that happens with the Placidus type chart, which is that we can get intercepted signs. This does not happen in whole sign houses. Um, And that means that in this particular example, the sign of Capricorn is in between cusps. This sixth house begins in Sagittarius, and the whole sign of Capricorn is in the middle of the sixth house. And then the sixth house ends with Aquarius. So there's not a cusp where Capricorn um, rules that house, or Capricorn governs that house. So um, this is another aspect of Placidus, and another thing to interpret with this style of house. And the class that we're going to be teaching will really go into depth into what is an intercepted sign and how do you interpret it. So at this moment, I'm not going to do that interpretation, but I did want to give people an idea of where are the houses and what are the parts of a house. So I'll stop that share. Do you have anything to add about that piece there, Bonnie?
Um, I'm still a little confused about intercepted houses. And I know it's been explained to me, so I'm looking forward because I'm still learning a lot about Placidus.
Mhm.
Like I'm still learning about like what that means. So I'm looking forward to going more into detail about it in the class again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. My favorite metaphor that I learned is that the intercepted sign is especially if you have planets that are in that intercepted sign. It's like that planet is sort of hidden away in the house, but it blossoms and grows over the course of our life. So
Mm-hmm.
it's something that's a little hidden and then emerges. It's my favorite way to think about
Yeah. Yeah,
house.
I like that. I think my chart also doesn't have like in Placidus, it doesn't have any intercepted houses, so that might be why it's a bit harder for me to visualize. But I assume it's also pretty similar to how like we'll get into this later. Some of the differences of whole sign don't make much sense to people that use Placidus. There's like certain things that we're used to that when we switch house system, it's like, what is this? So yeah, we'll get into that soon.
Right. And just to like tell you that I do not have the math to explain how the houses are created through math, but the Placidus type. What I do know is that the Placidus type house system is called a quadrant based house system, which means you divide the sky into those four major points: the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, and IC or nadir, and you make those the cusp of the first, the seventh, the fourth, and the 10th houses. And so, and then whole sign has a lovely simplicity because it doesn't, you don't need any particular math because it's just the whole sign is the house,
Hmm.
which
Yeah, it's
is
pretty
beautiful
simple.
and simple. And there's something very elegant about that. Yes. So, as I said, I started studying astrology in the 80s, and this was before a lot of material from the Hellenistic era and before and after had been interpreted and translated. And so that there's been just a very large upwelling of information and teaching about Hellenistic and traditional astrology. And so, what I learned, astrology before that, I learned what we now define as modern astrology when I was becoming an astrologer. And so there are some differences, and I'm really curious about what those differences are. And some people get really attached to their way of doing it, I've noticed. But one of the things that I learned, and I still value, even though it has become a little less acceptable, is the idea that the houses and the signs and the elements have some affinity with each other. So I'm going to share another screen and just kind of show you that. And why is this important? For me, what I am trying to do with these associations is get to the meaning of a house. What does a house mean? And I have this way of thinking about houses that there are layers of meaning. There are we can have the house can mean something that is just a physical reality thing. So everything in our literal houses or in our literal lives can have a literal place in the astrology chart. So for instance, the first house is about our bodies, and that's a physical level thing. But then I also think there's another layer, which is around the psychology of what is the psychological meaning of a house. And for me, the first house would be a house of discovering who I am and that quest for self knowledge. And so then there's also the spiritual meaning of a house, which could be for the first house is, my impact in the world, my way of interfacing with the rest of creation. And so what's my particular soul purpose? That can be talked about in the first house. And then, we also, in our class, we also queer the houses. And, we can talk about that first house as coming out as queer or naming ourselves, like finding our true name, our gender identity. That first house can govern those things too. So there's so many layers. And so what I like to do with these affinities is just help me to get to the energy, the energetic layer of a house. So for instance, that first house that I just described in all of those different ways, when I learned astrology, it was called the astrological alphabet, that the first house equaled Aries and equaled the fire element, and it equaled the planet Mars, which rules Aries. And that was a very, very, very simplistic way of learning. And I know that Bonnie has some thoughts about this, so I'm really interested in learning that. But this was a beginning um, way of just kind of understanding what the differences between the houses were. So tell me more about how you learned about these things and what you think about this, Bunny.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so to go back to that, I've been studying astrology for way less time than you have, but the timing of like when I got into astrology was basically, yeah, about 2 years ago when the pandemic started. It was actually through TikTok, just like seeing a lot of astrology videos on TikTok and learning about different traditions, basically learning more about traditional Hellenistic astrology. So during this time, like maybe in the last like about probably I would say a decade, Hellenistic astrology has been making more of a comeback due to a lot of translation projects. So there were a lot of texts like Hellenistic texts about astrology that we didn't really have access to. So that's why traditional astrology has kind of like taken off in the last decade. So the timing of when I found out about astrology was pretty interesting because if I had found out, if I had studied astrology like, maybe when I was younger, I probably wouldn't have known about traditional astrology. So it's kind of like a luck
Mhm.
of the draw too. But yeah, I mostly focus on traditional astrology, but I do like to mix up with different styles. And so one of the first ways that I've approached houses like through learning traditional astrology is basically assigning the planets, sign, and houses and aspects. Those are like the four building blocks of astrology, assigning them to basically different metaphors for like a play.
Mhm.
So we talk about the planets in traditional astrology as like the main actors in your chart. A lot of people, when they're first coming to astrology from like pop astrology, it's like, oh, I'm a Scorpio, I'm an Aquarius. It's very much like I am this sign.
Mhm.
But in traditional astrology, we kind of like unlearned that and we learned like, oh, the planets are actually the more driving force of your chart, and the signs are kind of the role they're playing. So
Mhm.
in that analogy, the planets are actors, the signs are the role they're playing. And then I'll get into this in a second, but which planets traditionally rule a certain sign, so like Mars ruling Aries or Venus ruling Taurus, what happens when those planets are in different signs that they don't rule, and how that changes things. That's a whole other conversation about signs. For
Mhm.
houses, though, the houses are the setting in the play. So the houses represent like the different parts of your life. So, like Tara mentioned, the first house is you. There are other parts, and there are other houses in the chart that are things like family, career, your finances, your partnerships. So, each in whole sign house system, each house will be represented by a sign. It's like equally divided. So each house would be ruled by one sign, and that sign would be ruled by a planet. So I'll backtrack a little bit there. But does that make sense to you, Tara? I can also go into the chart ruler idea too.
Mhm. Well, yeah, that does make sense. I think that that is the criticism that I have heard. The criticism that I've heard about not equating house with sign and sign ruler is that it blurs all of those distinctions. It blurs it, like we want to recognize that signs are separate from houses. That Aries could, in our own personal charts, will probably not be in the first house. And sometimes that really confuses new learners too. It's like we take that Aries sort of energy and place it in the house and go, Aries really likes to assert itself. And so there's a piece of that energy with the first house where we can assert ourselves. We can just like, muscle our way in like an Aries. But if our first house begins with, say, Pisces, we're not going to be very aggressive about how we assert our identities. It's going to be a lot more, um, gentle, perhaps, or
Mm,
maybe a little more hesitation. But it's still, so it is confusing. I agree to equate house and sign. um, and I also kind of like the reason I kind of like use it though is it really helps me to understand the energy.
mm,
That's a firehouse, even though you could have water there or earth there in your own chart. And so it's kind of it is confusing, and maybe
mm.
it's something to sort of layer on. I find astrology is a lot about layering on things.
Yeah, I love
You know,
that.
and
Yeah,
that's
I
the
think
part. Hmm.
yeah, I think that that is like one of the criticisms from like people that use traditional astrology about equating the signs and houses, that it kind of simplifies things. I do like it for, like you said, kind of learning the essence of that house. So like the first house being about identity and equating it to Aries. I just don't use it as like a practice for, yeah, just simply because like people have different rising signs. So I prefer to look at the chart ruler of that particular rising sign. But I do agree that it's a good way of like learning the houses, because the houses, and we'll get into this in the class, they're very complex. They have so many different significations.
Hmm.
So it's just like there's so many things. So it is nice to have a system that kind of or a metaphor with the signs that makes it a little easier to understand. I think my main thing is that I wouldn't want new astrologers to get confused by learning it first, because you can get really trapped into fourth house is Cancer, seventh house is Libra, and think that they're the same when they are two different things. You can definitely play around with like using the signs to view the houses, but I think I like the metaphor of like the settings for the actors, the planets and the signs being the role they play, so you can see the different layers.
Hmm. Fair enough.
Yeah.
I know that it is. And so I'll stop that share. So yeah, it is. I've run into that in teaching using that model where people are a little confused of how that translates
Hmm.
to their own chart.
And some of them are really interesting, like Scorpio being the eighth house. The eighth house is such a hard house to explain.
Hmm.
So yeah, for me thinking of Scorpio and themes like sex and death and like the vulnerability and like thinking about eighth house, that is like a helpful metaphor to learn the houses. Yeah. So I'm okay with like using it as a tool. I just don't want it to be like the main tool for me personally.
Yeah, no, that
Yeah.
totally works. I understand that. Um, So let's get down to a little bit more of what the difference between Placidus and whole sign is. Would you like to start that?
Yeah, I can start with whole sign. Let me look at my notes. So like we mentioned before, so whole sign house system is debated as one of the oldest house systems. There's definitely a debate going on with a lot of astrologers about which one is the oldest house system, and I'm not going to into that because I think there's still a lot of like, even with like the translations of Hellenistic texts like 10 years ago or so, there's still a lot more that we don't know. So I will just say it's one of the oldest house systems. And so right now I think there are also many more house systems besides Placidus and Whole Sign. So we're just talking about the ones that we use, Placidus and Whole Sign, but I think these are two of the more popular ones. But in Whole Sign, the sign boundaries are basically equal to the houses. So in Placidus, for example, like if you're a 28-degree Capricorn rising, it's going to look a lot different. Whereas in whole sign, even if you are 28-degree Capricorn, like at the very edge of that sign, your first house is still going to be completely Capricorn, even if it's at 28 degrees of Capricorn. So it's a little bit different because Placidus is all about the points, like the ascendant, descendant, MC, and IC, and whole sign is just like very neat. It's like each sign is a house.
Mhm.
Um, and let's see, what else did I write? Yeah. And then, so there's different pros and cons to that. I think one of the main differences, and we'll talk about this like Tere with Placidus too. I think that whole sign is like particularly used for things like timing, like more external events, whereas Placidus seems to be more of like a psychological internal feeling. So like I think that, I don't think there's any like wrong way to do astrology. I think it just kind of depends on what you want to do. But whole sign is particularly good for things related to timing. It's also particularly good for things like writing horoscopes that are based off the houses. So because like everyone has their ascendant point in like different degrees of a sign, and they're all from different areas of the world, their house is going to look very different in Placidus, but in whole sign it's much more simple. So like someone could write a horoscope for Aquarius risings, and a lot of the life events are going to show up very similarly because the transits of the planets going through that house, it's not going to change based off that individual person's chart. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Mhm.
It's basically more simple for writing horoscopes. Um, for whole sign, there are some timing techniques that are very particular with whole sign that you can't really use with Placidus. So things like annual perfections, which is the idea that every year, when you have your birthday, mine's tomorrow, so I'm going from a 12th house year to a first house year as an example. Basically, whenever you have your birthday, aka your solar return, it activates another house in your chart. So
Mhm.
for me in the last year, it's been 12th house themes, and now I'm going to a new year and it's first house themes. So that's something particular to whole sign, that technique. There are other techniques I haven't learned yet that are very advanced, like zodiacal releasing, that are also particular to whole sign, but I'm not quite there yet. And the other thing I like about whole sign is that I prefer to use it for electional astrology.
Mhm.
Electional astrology is when you, I should have mentioned this before, but it's basically when you select a particular chart to have an event, like say someone is getting married and they want a good chart for their wedding. You would use electional astrology to kind of craft the best time for that event. And people use it for opening businesses. We use it for magic, for example. So electional astrology is a bit more simple of whole sign because if you're, providing a time, if I'm providing like a time for people to use in different parts of the world, that chart is going to look very different in Placidus for different people. So in whole sign, it's just like much simpler because it'll look the same for everyone. Yeah.
Mhm.
What else do I have? I think, oh, one other thing, yeah, one other thing is that with transits, with the when we talk about, like, for example, what I mentioned before about writing horoscopes with whole sign, if you're writing about all Aries risings, you can describe the same transit going through the same house in their chart.
Mhm.
Um, I do think that when we get into Placidus, we can talk about the differences between like, yeah, external events versus psychological.
Mhm.
And I feel like, yeah, for example, if someone is like a very late degree of Aries rising, a particular transit might feel very different to them. So that is one limitation where it's like in whole sign houses, you can describe pretty well the timing of events, but there might be some transits for people that feel really different because their chart is different in Placidus. So maybe that's something you can touch on, Tere. And then one of the other differences is that the angles of the MC and the IC change in whole sign, as opposed to Placidus, where the chart is more based off the points of the IC and the MC. So the IC always is the fourth house, the MC is always the 10th house. In whole sign, the IC can be anywhere from the second to the sixth house, and with the MC, it can be anywhere from the eighth to the 12th house. So it does, well, like we were talking about before, if intercepted houses, there's a bit of complexity because you're like, oh, the 10th house is career, but this person's MC point is in the 11th house. What does that mean? And what we kind of do with that is we just kind of blend those two house meanings together. So if someone is having a transit in their 10th house, career things might still be activated, but they might also be activated if their MC point is in the 9th house, for example. So it is a bit more complicated with that. So that's something also I encourage people to look at their chart in both house systems and kind of see how it feels to have both of those house systems. So if you notice that your MC is different in one house, you can kind of feel it out and see what feels more true for you.
Mhm.
I think that was a long ramble, but hopefully I got some of the main points. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. So as I said, when I learned astrology, I learned the Placidus house system because it was the most, commonly taught one. And so what it is, I'm going to share that chart again, that I shared before, just to kind of have a visual. Because we talked about things like midheaven and nadir or MC and IC. This line here, this is the highest. The midheaven is the highest point in the sky, and the nadir is the lowest point in the sky. And in a quadrant-based system like Placidus, and there are other ones that are based on, let's divide the sky into these four big points. What is rising on the horizon and what's setting on the opposite horizon? What's culminating at the beginning, at the middle, at the highest point of the sky, and then what is, the deepest part below us. And so I am so drawn to that. It's sort of like as a witch, I have done infinite numbers of groundings, where I just like go to the stars above me and sink my roots down below me, and it just feels like it's such a alignment. So that I get confused. I don't understand. How can you have a chart where the midheaven in this particular chart, 12 degrees, and I don't have an example of it in whole sign, but it could be like Bonnie said, it could be this midheaven could be over here in the eighth. And that it would be, since that's Aquarius, this would be, let's see, Aquarius. So yeah, this would be, if this is Aquarius, this is Pisces house, this would be the Aries house. So in this particular example, the midheaven would be in the ninth house rather than the cusp of the 10th, and the 10th house being the meaning of it being, what are we aspiring to? What are we aspiring to achieve? It's our profession or career. But then we would have to take into account that it's also in the ninth house. So we're aspiring to something that has a flavor of the ninth house. I think it's something that I've started to understand better, but at the first it was just like, no, I have to have this midheaven alignment. It's just so important. So that is kind of like that's what the quadrant system is doing, and that is what it's valuing. It's valuing how the midheaven begins the 10th house, and the nadir begins the fourth house, which is the house of our homes and our deepest selves and our ancestry and our families. And so that's very relevant too. Um, so yeah, it's kind of why I was drawn to it. But the downside of Placidus is that the more you go towards a pole, like towards the North Pole or the South Pole, you will have more of those intercepted houses. You could have like three in a row of intercepted houses that then just have become really strange, another way of interpreting, and it has a detriment. Like I don't do a lot of readings for people who are born in higher latitudes, but I definitely would consider moving to whole sign just for that, because those interceptions are strange. And also, I think what I'm thinking philosophically about the two systems as I start to open to practicing them and using them is that I think of the whole sign system as being very elegant and mathematical, and has a certain order, like this, the order of the heavens kind of feeling to it. Whereas Placidus is more of like the internal kind of byways and strangeness, that kind of is inside of us. And I listened to a talk once by Jean Sart, who said that when she does a reading, she'll always present both charts and say, this is your external reality, the whole sign, and then this is how you feel about it, or this is what you're thinking about yourself inside of yourself. And I really am intrigued by that. I'm intrigued by just using both and sort of comparing and seeing what that system looks like. We were going to look at an example of that, right?
Yes.
That okay.
Yeah, yeah, I think that would be great. It's a perfect way to illustrate the yeah, I like the idea of and this is all like stuff we're like still figuring out as astrologers, like what are the differences between whole sign and Placidus, but I feel like Placidus does kind of better describe like the more psychological and the more internal. Um, so I'm really excited to learn more about the intercepted houses so we can get into that. Because I just since I don't have intercepted houses, I need to hear about it from like other people and other examples. So this is a perfect
Yeah.
example of Lizzo's chart.
Yeah, this is Lizzo, whom I adore. And I think that she does have a very, big personality that, people have a story about who she is. And maybe she has a different, more internal experience of who she is than what her persona is. And so maybe we can just look at that, look at the differences. Over here we have the whole sign. And so this gives you a visual of each sign, each house begins at 0 degree of a sign, and it's the whole sign, and then the next house. Um, in this particular instance, the midheaven is still in the 10th house, but it's at the end of Taurus rather than at this line here, and that Lizzo's ascendant is right at the end of Leo. So we have all this here, that is also the first house. So yeah, what do you see about this, Bonnie?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things I can imagine, but since I don't know Lizzo personally, it's I can only imagine.
Mhm.
But yeah, with the whole sign house system, she has her chart ruler, the sun in Leo. That's something we can get into a little bit if there's time. But with both of these systems, you can use the planet like ruling that sign to get more of a definition of that house. So her chart ruler is in the 10th house in whole sign, with a big emphasis on career. It's also really close to her Jupiter in Taurus, her Mercury in Taurus, and her MC is there in the 10th house in whole sign.
Mhm.
But in Placidus, her sun, her chart ruler is in the 9th house, which deals with topics such as world travel and spirituality and religion. It's a very worldly house. So um, yeah, I think that's super interesting. It makes me wonder that it makes me wonder if personally she's a lot more spiritual.
Mhm.
I have a feeling that she is spiritual. I know that she's on Astro TikTok all the time, so I feel like she has a personal astrologer with her last album release. When there was a lot of Taurus planets going on in her 10th house. But I feel like I wonder if like internally she's like this, she's much more spiritual, and then it shows up in her career on the outside to people.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I watched her reality TV show, Big Girls, and I associate the ninth house also with wanting to teach, like seek meaning and then teach it. And she really just really had that point of view and with the girls that she was taking in. And I'm calling them girls because that was the name of the show, but the women that came in and auditioned over the course of the show to be a dancer, a backup dancer for Lizzo. And there was a lot of education, a lot of personal development, and just like it was a lot more than just learning dances. And
Yeah.
that feels a lot like having a son in the ninth house versus what we see is someone who's extremely successful, just very lucky, or lucky in that way that Jupiter can be lucky in the 10th house of things. Just kind of her career is just so amazing, and she's a big influence in the big world. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think that I like that, yeah, the topic of ninth house being about teaching too. I do notice with even just like her TikToks and like her media, it feels like she is very intentional about how she talks to the public
Mhm.
about like herself and her body image. Like I would imagine that some of the mean things people say about her do get to her, but she tries to show off this like image of I'm gonna do me and take care of myself and like not give in to the haters. I'm gonna be even more of myself. And I think that she's also doing that to be a role model. Like I think she has said that she wants to be a role model to other women, plus size women. And she really shows that with like her mentorship too. So I feel like she is like a mentor.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely, absolutely. 100%, yeah. Another difference in the charts is Mars. I think the Mars is a pretty interesting difference. Um, in whole sign, it's in the seventh house, and in Placidus, it's the sixth. Um, and so the sixth house has to do with health, um, well-being and health, and the seventh house having to do with that interaction with the other. So partnering in a sense, but it's also just like that impact, that the other people, that engagement with other people. And I see that Placidus, I see that Mars as fueling a passion for health. I mean, I know she's a vegan. I know she's incredibly dedicated to her well-being and exercise and dance, and just that whole like the wholeness of well-being. Like I think the sixth house is kind of that wholeness of well-being as well. Um, and maybe some of the problems that can happen with Mars in the sixth house is a tendency to inflammation. So, that might be something that she suffers, that kind of inflammation in the joints or in the body. So it'd be something I'd think about with
Hmm.
Lizzo. Yeah,
Hmm.
but then how would you interpret Mars in the seventh in the whole?
Yeah, Mars in the seventh house. Seventh house deals with partnerships, and in some cases we would think of like dating partners, maybe marriages or just like short-term, long-term dating. I could also see it being about business partners. So I do wonder, I don't know much about like her business partner, like who she works with, but I wonder if she's had conflict with people she's worked with. But it could also be like maybe just like, being someone who's not afraid to speak out to people she works with or people who she's dating, like being very outspoken about conflict and not like hiding it. Mars in Aquarius, I have Mars in Aquarius, and I feel like it's a bit more of a long-term thinking strategic Mars too.
Mhm.
It's an air sign, so it's not quite as aggressive as like Mars in Aries, but I think it's more about the long-term vision and strategy, like playing chess.
Mm,
So I wonder, yeah, if she's like has some strategy with her relationships or her partnerships.
mhm,
But going back to the sixth house thing, I also that when it comes to like things like sixth house topics like diet and wellness and exercise, being vegan can sometimes have like a humanitarian reason, not always, but with Mars and Aquarius too. Aquarius is a very humanitarian sign too.
it's true. Yeah. Yeah, one of in this particular example, we're not seeing a real big difference in rulerships of houses. So, for
Hmm.
instance, I guess the 12th house in the whole is ruled by the moon because it's Cancer, but in Lizzo's Placidus house, it's ruled by the sun.
Hmm.
And we do find one pair of interceptions in Lizzo's Placidus chart, which is Cancer in the 11th, and all of these Capricorn planets in the 5th. So that's sort of an example of having intercepted planets. And one of them, these three planets came together at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and really important. Uranus, Saturn, and Neptune coming together to sort of like bring a whole generation of people into a new age, a new era, and redefining the rules and the boundaries. That's the Capricorn thing of the world. And the people at this age are really now starting to influence culture, like in a huge way.
Hmm.
Um, and so Lizzo's a huge influence. But, maybe having this intercepted Saturn and Aquarius, Capricorn, maybe it was a matter of I've got some gifts of like creating a whole new. I just think about her clothing line and her music and all the things that she's created in this kind of very business-like sense. But maybe it took a while for her to really believe that she could change so much and create in this way. So that might be an internal experience of having the Saturn in the fifth house, um, which is about creativity and also intercepted. So maybe it took a while, although she's still pretty young, so it didn't take too long. Whereas in the whole, that trio of planets are in the sixth house, and just like that's something that I would kind of, if I were doing a reading with Lizzo and using the two systems at once, I would ask about, where do you feel your Saturn? Where do you feel this sense of I have some obstructions, but I also have something really important to do. It could
Hmm.
be in the sixth house, and it could be in the fifth house.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
Yeah, so where does that show up in your life? Because fifth house is a lot more about fun and like pleasure and creativity, but sixth house is a lot more of a work house, I think.
right.
Like doing daily tasks, taking care of your body, work tasks. So
Yeah.
like I would be very interested to hear like how that feels for Lizzo. Because yeah, Saturn in the sixth house makes me think of that kind of similar to Mars and Aquarius, that like kind of long-term strategy. So maybe she's someone who has like been patiently like working on her vision and is seeing it through in a very long-term vision kind of way.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think health wise, Mars in the sixth and Saturn in the sixth, those were two different health issues.
Yeah,
So that
that's
would be
interesting.
interesting, if you have a
But
client.
Mars and Aquarius would be ruled by that Saturn and Capricorn, so there is a bit of a relationship
Yeah,
there.
there is, right?
Yeah.
And so what we're talking about is how we're looking at that sign on the cusp. And in the Placidus, it's Aquarius. Saturn happens to rule both Aquarius and Capricorn. And so we're in this whole sign. This is Capricorn. So Saturn rules the sixth house in both charts, but through different signs. One through
Yeah.
Capricorn and one through Aquarius. So yeah.
It's kind of fun how like sometimes two different house systems can still explain the same kind of picture, but in different ways. Like I have the same thing in my chart too.
Mhm.
Yeah. So yeah, that seems to me like, yeah, I wonder like with Saturn or Mars in the sixth house, maybe there is some kind of body issue and maybe it comes off differently in the outside world versus like internally.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed looking at that chart with you, Bonnie.
that was fun.
And I'm curious if anyone in our who's here has a question for us or anything that you'd like to know. Um, and
Questions.
questions are great. You can write them. I can also, if you feel like talking, I can do that part too. Can unmute everyone if you want to. Um, so you can unmute yourself now if you feel like asking a question. I say, if you're interested in this type of approach to astrology, which is kind of those levels of magic and social justice and queerness and personal discovery, I think that that's what we're trying to do, and really would love to have others join us. We're found on Patreon at Starsdance Mystery School.
Yeah, and if you join us on Discord, we have a channel for charts. So the Lizzo example was one we talked about a while back. So if you notice any other like cool celebrity or like politician charts that seem to have that difference in Placidus and Whole Sign, it would be a really fun exercise to share that, and we can talk about some of the differences and similarities.
Mhm. I think we'll do that for our class.
Mm-hmm.
Which
Yeah.
begins, I think, on December 6th. Hmm. Well,
December 8th, I think. Yeah.
oh, is it the 8th? Okay, thank you. December 8th.
I
Um,
have a question.
sure.
So I just want to make sure that I kind of understand at least a little bit of what I learned. Um, so I looked at my natal chart with both the Placidus and the whole sign, and my Mars in Gemini on my Placidus is in my 10th house,
Mhm.
and in the whole sign it's in my 11th house. So does that kind of mean that like my creative drive, like I experience it as being focused on my career, but like out in the world it's more like suited for like helping the collective?
Yeah, that could be a great way to interpret it.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that's a great way. Sorry, go ahead, Tier.
yeah, no. Um, and your internal drive is in that outer world. There's a connection between the 10th and the 11th house. The 10th house is what we're reaching towards, and the 11th house is where we apply it out in our communities. And so it's kind of like um, you're still internally feel like you need to move towards more definition of what you're doing in the world, but people might see you in your community settings already doing that. And so that gives, I think, as I think about that, I feel like there's a sense of I'm never done learning about how my career can align with what I do.
Yeah,
But other people can see that as well. You are doing that. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I also think that the houses near each other, like for example, ninth, 10th, and 11th, tend to have, like for me, like when it comes to having the MC in one of those houses, I can see them mixing really well together because the 11th house, it deals with like the collective and like it's kind of a social networking kind of house. So it could be about networking with your job too. It could be about the humanitarian aspects, like doing things with like social justice, for example, like helping people and how those things tie into your career. So I can see those two tying together well. But yeah, like Tara said, it might feel very different internally versus externally
Hmm.
and how people see you.
Hmm.
Cool. Thank you.
And happy Mars return.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
I,
Yeah, it's
Fun
a little
one.
intense.
Yeah, it's a long one this time. Yeah.
right. Yeah. I also have Mars and Gemini.
That's right.
Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah.
We'll send out a recording of this and hope to see you in another class or something.
Yeah. Thanks for the questions, everyone. Thanks for showing up.
Bye.
Bye.